why don't we get started then? For those of you who've been at this a little while, and that looks like just a few of you at this point, I wanted to ask some kind of basic questions. Who's familiar with forensics and what that really means? Nusheen, can you give me like a 2-sentence description of what forensics is about?
Oh, sorry. Just collection of evidence.
Yeah. Okay. And then we're also going to talk about the EDRM a little bit. Can somebody give me kind of a brief description of what the EDRM is about? Maybe Lindsay, you're kind of new and you've been through boot camp recently. Can you give me like a 1-sentence description of what the EDRM reflects?
Yeah, it's all of the stages of the electronic discovery reference model. So it's everything from, collections all the way through processing, hosting, and contract attorneys. So it's the whole process. Okay.
Can somebody kind of give me a description of what the objective of forensics is? I mean, Nusheen has kind of laid that out as collection, but why would we want to do collection via a forensic tool, and why would we not want to allow clients to do that? Anybody want to take that one? Anybody?
Yeah, this is Lindsay again.
Oh, Lindsay.
Okay. Never mind, Nicole.
Go ahead, Nicole.
On the last part, did you say why we would want them to do it? Or would it?
Yeah, why would we want to use forensics rather than letting people kind of copy their own data over and send it to us?
It's perfectly defensible. It takes the liability away from the firm or the client, and also we have methods to do it that prevent spoliation or altering of metadata.
Great answer. Perfect answer. All right, so why don't we get started then? Steve, you got comments?
I just had a quick question. So does everybody know what spoliation is? So Nicole referenced spoliation. Does everybody else know what spoliation is, or do we want to talk briefly about that?
Yeah, we should probably talk about that just briefly. Can anybody give me kind of a 1-sentence description of what spoliation is? I think Sam could probably give us a 1-sentence description of what spoliation is.
Spoliation?
Yeah, I put you right on the spot there. Sorry, man.
He's like, Google.
So spoliation is any kind of alteration of the original evidence when it's collected.
Yeah.
Or I think in a lot of the court cases it has more to do with deletion of data that could have been used for evidentiary purposes.
Yep.
Now, Sam, could spoliation also apply? Could there be an instance of spoliation where a forensic company or a litigation support company does the collection, and there was they didn't use the proper tools, and let's say that the metadata was not preserved properly? Would that also fall in the category of spoliation?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, there's sort of a burden of getting a true and correct copy of the original, and any alteration of it could be spoliation. So let's say if you collect data, and if you do like a Windows copy of, let's say, a Word document, the system creation date changes if that Word document is copied from one repository to another. Then that could be torn apart if there's some kind of dispute about the authenticity of that evidence that you're collecting. So yeah, that's a very dangerous thing, and that's why law firms and corporations hire forensics people so that the collection is done properly.
And I have this is Steve. I had a good example recently. DLA, an associate, an international client for them with 3 locations, one in Scottsdale and then 2 overseas. And their internal IT department was going through and doing the collection, mostly from file shares and email. And he was kind of alerted to their process and wasn't sure what they were doing was defensible and that they were doing it properly to preserve metadata. So within about 5 minutes of a phone call, Mike Chiramataro in forensics and myself and the client and the end client, and them talking about their process and Mike asking a few questions, within 5 minutes I had an email saying, I need to get a proposal from you for you to do this. And next week we're going to kick off that collection. So that's, it's extremely important to make sure that with the process that they're undertaking, there's times when we come in as a consultant to the internal IT department because they have, the software and support to do it, and they want our oversight. So there's just an example of, a client trying to do it on their own, but not doing it the right way, and, us being able to intercept that.
Okay. All right, so why don't we just start with some basics here. And, I try to express everything kind of in relation to the EDRM, and I just wanted to spend just maybe 5 minutes at the most covering the EDRM here. This stands for Electronic Discovery Reference Model. I think you're all pretty familiar with this. We've all kind of looked in conference rooms and talked about this at different aspects now. It all starts with information on the client end, information management. Where are they storing their information and how are they storing it? In some cases, we're starting to see clients that are taking a kind of pre-litigation stance and are starting to organize their documents in a fashion that will lower the cost of them responding to litigation because their documents are already organized in some fashion. I worked with a pharmaceutical company about 7 or 8 years ago, and they were taking very strong steps. They understood that for the majority of the products that they were going to sell, they were going to be sued. So their paralegal team had actually derived a methodology for storing and managing their documents in preparation for litigation. So we're starting to see this from companies that are highly litigious or expect to get sued regularly. Now, there's also identification, and this is where we're going to come to some agreement about which documents are potentially responsive to the litigation at hand. But the aspect that we're going to talk about is going to be preservation and collection today. Kind of the bread and butter of our business is this processing of the collected data into space so that we can analyze it, for example, in an ECA workspace, and then review it and then produce it. Now, presentation is for a courtroom presentation. That's kind of outside of our model here. But note that as we move further along the timeline here, the likely relevance of the documents to the litigation increases. So you can see we have lots of volume, very little relevance to the litigation. At the other end, we have more relevant documents, but there are far fewer documents. So this is kind of like making maple syrup when you think about it a little bit. All right, now I want to just talk about the EDRM very, very briefly here. This is going to be review for the majority of you here. And one of the things that I noted when I was reading the EDRM webpage yesterday is that this is really a conceptual view of the EDRM process. In some cases, all the steps may or may not be appropriate. So, for example, if you have a very strong, maybe you've been sued on the same product prior, so maybe you don't need to go back and collect new documents. For example, Dow, when they were in trouble for breast implants, they basically assembled a set of documents of about 50 or 60 documents, and that was their standard data set. So for each litigation that arose, they did not have to go back and collect a review or anything. They just had the set of documents that they had vetted multiple times and just produced them. So depending on the case and depending on the organization, you may or may not have to exercise the steps every time a new matter arises. Now, it's also an iterative view. So has anybody here ever worked on a case where they do collection and then they realize that they need to go back and do additional collection even though they've already started doing production? Has anybody worked on a case like that? Anybody? Britt, you ever worked on a case like that?
I've heard of people who've had to do that, and yeah, actually I did too. So I've tried to block it out of my memory. Had to go back and get a new custodian of a prior employee who ended up being important, and the client didn't know about.
Right, right. So it was one of the. So I would assume that this would be a step where you had come back in and maybe during analysis here realized that you need to take a step back and do additional collection from one of your custodians. Is that kind of the scenario here?
Oh yeah. We didn't even know he was like a custodian we should collect from, or that he was even relevant to our case at all. And then we kind of started seeing a lot of stuff going on and had to go find his old stuff on, backup servers.
Ouch, ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think. No, and I think that what we found here is that we may have large cases that are already in review and we've already begun production, and then they start to negotiate with opposing counsel and we identify additional documents. So we may have, in a single case, multiple steps occurring simultaneously, all right? So this isn't a linear kind of ABC sort of process. You know, the steps may be performed in a different order, and because you learn new knowledge, like in Brittany's case, for example, you may have to go back to some earlier steps here, okay? So understand that this isn't, you know, A, B, C, D, E. Sometimes it might be A, B, C, A, B, C, D, A, B, right? So kind of be aware that as you're working with your clients, they may be asking for things that you thought would have already occurred, particularly collection, after the case is already rolling pretty hard. All right, now for today, we're going to talk a little bit, mostly here, about preservation and collection. I just wanted to give this EDRM overview here so we can kind of understand, you know, where this fits in our overall model. Okay, so let me just flip my notes over here. All right, so let's talk about what preservation is here. Preservation of documents is required as soon as there are reasonable expectation of litigation. Now, this doesn't mean that you wait until the, you know, until the complaint arrives. But if you are negotiating with opposing, you know, somebody who's got a problem with you, you know, you are duty-bound to start preserving documents. And this can include a couple of things. Number one, you want to suspend destruction of documents. So what does that mean? Who can give me an example of what destruction of documents might entail? Lindsay, you've got a lot of answers today, so I'm going to pick on you a little bit. Okay.
When maybe they start like deleting things from their hard drives or things like that.
Okay, okay, so that's one example. Who can think about this maybe in a more network type of environment, thinking about backups and that sort of thing? Has anybody got some insight into other ways that they may unknowingly destroy documents without necessarily understanding it?
I have a question. Is this the point where it's considered legal hold?
Exactly. That's exactly what we're talking about. My apologies for not being clear about that. Okay, so let's say that you have a company where they have 31 backup tapes. Okay, so each backup tape goes in the backup slot every night, and then in the morning somebody comes out, they take that tape, they put it in a file cabinet, and then they put you know, the next day's tape in, and they just keep rolling these same 31 tapes over and over and over again. Well, what happens when you've got that 31st tape, and now you switch back over to the first tape? What happens to that first tape when it goes in the box? Well, it's going to get overwritten. And so in that case, what you're doing is you're potentially destroying documents. So in that case, that's a way that a client can get themselves in trouble, is by allowing backup tapes to continue to cycle. Okay, so that's one way that they can get in trouble. They may also have systems where they archive emails. So every 90 days, like my wife works at a bank, and about every 90 days, they basically cull everything out of her inbox that's over 90 days old, and they just blow it away. Now, if there was a litigation hold in place relative to some particular aspect of the bank, once those documents had been blown away, well, you know, you're again potentially destroying documents, and you may be getting yourself in trouble with spoliation because you're violating a litigation hold here where you should be preserving your documents. There's also, you know, these are kind of unintentional ways to destroy your documents, but there's also intentional destruction of documents. I don't know if anybody remembers Enron, but basically Arthur Andersen knew that the kind of hammer was coming down, so they basically spent all their time destroying documents and shredding and everything else, and that resulted in people going to jail. So spoliation is a big deal, especially once there's a litigation hold in place. And I would say that if you were Arthur Andersen and you were working with Enron, I think that you would have a reasonable expectation that there was litigation coming, okay? So lit hold is an important part of this, and if we think back to our EDRM model, this preservation of the data is really the first aspect of a good forensic collection. Okay, any questions on this? Everybody good? Okay. All right, so let's talk about what forensics actually is. Now, you know, we kind of lump it into one thing, and I'm sure that when you talk to people that you know, meet at parties or your friends, and you talk about that you do forensics, they start thinking CSI stuff. Well, you know, the fact of the matter is that it's often much more mundane than that. It's really the acquisition of potentially relevant electronically stored information, or ESI, is defined in the identification phase. Now, I pulled this right off of the EDRM webpage because I thought it was a pretty concise description of what we're trying to accomplish here, right? We've preserved it in the first step, and now in the second step, we're going to collect that data in a fashion that allows us to represent that data accurately as we're going through reviewing it and producing, right? So our goal is an exact image or copy of the appropriate data. All right, now there are kind of two, and I'm going to get into that a little bit more when we start to talk about tool types, but there are really two types of collection here. One is where we show up and we do a full disk image. Okay, so we're going to make a copy of somebody's hard drive, and it is going to be stored, in most cases, in our case when we send somebody out there, it's going to be stored in a fashion that basically is a bit for bit representation of the original custodian's hard drive. Okay. And I'm going to talk about why that's a little important a little bit later on. Or in other cases, we may do what's called a targeted collection. Can somebody give me an example of what a targeted collection might be? What might be entailed in a targeted collection? What that would mean?
Maybe with specific file types that they already know are appropriate.
Exactly, exactly. And you may see this applied for things like date ranges, right? We only want specific date ranges, or maybe we're collecting up off of a network server and we're only going to collect a specific custodian's shared folders up on the network server, right? So that's a targeted collection, which is a little different than we're going to show up in the middle of the night and we're going to make an image of your disk and you may or may not know about it, okay? So there's kind of two basic ways that we do this. Now we have a pretty wide variety of sources where we can collect data. And I'm going to start with some basics here. Let's talk about cloud computing. Can anybody give me examples of what type of documents we might be referencing when we talk about cloud computing? Carolyn, you got any thoughts on what that might mean when we look at cloud computing?
I guess companies who would dump all their emails onto a cloud server.
Okay. Okay. What about Google Docs? Do you think that would be a good example of cloud storage?
Yeah, that would be a really good example of cloud storage.
Okay, just thought I'd put the words right in your mouth there.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Just trying to be helpful here. All right, so there would be things like Google Docs, Gmail, or maybe a Citrix virtual desktop. So you may have clients who basically, in an effort to keep their network very, very stable, do something where basically people don't store any data on their local computers. They are basically accessing a server up on their network via Citrix, and that's very common. That's becoming more common. There are several law firms here in San Francisco that do that exclusively. So while you might show up and try and do a collection off of somebody's desktop, there might not be any actual data up there. It might be actually living up on a server. Now, in addition to cloud storage, there's kind of its cousin here, network shares, and those can include a couple of things. For example, we might have email repositories. Is everybody familiar with kind of how email really works here in most corporate environments? Anybody give me an example of the architecture? Sam, you're a network guy.
Email repositories?
Yeah, how does it typically work here on a network?
So you can think of email repositories as a separate sort of computer, also known as servers, and they're basically a big database system where they store all the people's the company's employees' emails. And when you go into Outlook, what you're actually seeing is the emails that are stored in this email server. So there's different types of email servers. There's the Exchange email server. That's a Microsoft product. There's a Lotus Notes server, and I believe that's an IBM product.
Yeah.
So it's just basically a repository, like a single repository where the company's employees and whoever is granted access to goes in, and the client email software, like an Outlook, will go in and grab the emails for you to be able to see.
Yep, yep. And so in some cases, this can be the best way to collect email, right? The person might be furiously deleting email off of their desktop while they're offline, and if you can catch it up here at Exchange, you might be able to pull it right out of their OST, their kind of Exchange mail storage file. Lotus Notes is basically a big IBM Domino server, and the files are stored in this NSF format. And there may also be things like Semantic Vault. Now, Semantic Vault can archive email up into a server. EMC used to have a product called Email Extender, and basically what it did is it kept one copy of every single email message inside an entire company and just stored information about who it was sent to, who had a copy, et cetera, et cetera. So these may be likely places for us to go investigate, collection of network shares for email. Now, there's also other places where we store data. I'm sure somebody's come across SharePoint, but these are structured Microsoft products that allow people to kind of treat a location up on their network as sort of a shared file folder. It's a little more complex than that, but basically data can live up there as well. Now, with kind of the rise of social media, this can be another place that we can look for data. We have successfully collected from Facebook, for example. Depending on the case, this may or may not be appropriate. This is generally more along the lines of things like employment cases and the like. It's generally not going to be a part of an IP case, unless people are blabbing confidential secrets online to their buddies. Okay. Now, there's also workstations, right? This is commonly what we think of when we think about collections, but let's think about all the kinds of gadgets that can be plugged into workstations that might be appropriate for collection as well. That could be items like external drives, right? Media or thumb drives, and we'll talk about this in a minute or two, but there are actually ways for us to understand which gadgets have been plugged into a worktop or a workstation here, and we can, you know, expand our amount of collection based on what we discover during forensic analysis. Okay, and then finally, there are mobile devices, and yes, we have ways to collect data from phones and tablets, and we're finding that this is more and more often part of the collection schema as we start to drill down. All right, questions on any of this? Collection sources, you guys good? All right, I'll take that as a yes then. Alrighty, now when are we going to need forensics? You know, there's kind of a couple of likely scenarios here, and I'm just going to cover two, but basically the potential situations are pretty broad. In one case, maybe you've got like an initial investigation. Has anybody ever worked on an employment case where they're just trying to find out if somebody's doing the bad thing? I'm sure Steve has. Maybe you can give us an example.
Yep. You know, several instances, especially when you have an employee that's leaving a company, and there's the possibility that that employee took some proprietary documents and information. And so typically in that situation, you know, we're harvesting the data, we're making a bit-for-bit copy, and then we go through a set of protocol. So that's, you know, in one scenario. There's other scenarios where you might have, I had one where we had a couple of board members that the CEO thought were up to no good, and so we actually went in after hours and collected email, workstations, you know, all of the different sources for these particular board members so that we could run them through the e-discovery process and provide them with some tools to run some searches against their emails and their workstation data to find out if what they're suspecting was true. So that would be another instance.
Yeah, this is exactly the scenario here, right? You have an initial investigation, maybe inside of a company, maybe somebody suspected of wrongdoing, which is exactly what Steve's scenario was. And then you just need to do a little collection on their email or files for just an investigation. Now, this doesn't have to have a very high forensic standard. I mean, it's just going to be used internally. But this is something that's very valuable for companies that, you know, suspect that something is going on. And again, it's kind of just part of the see what they have sort of scenario. Now, if you're more involved in, you know, document review and production, you know, you might need to collect multiple custodians in prep for litigation, and it's more likely to require full forensic defensibility for all the reasons Sam listed earlier, especially with regard to spoliation. Periodically, we will see, you know, organizations who are trying to cheap out. They're trying to save the $2,000, so they call their internal folks, and they're like, send any document that is potentially relevant to this project that went bad. Well, I don't know about you, but I would suspect that some of those custodians are not going to send along all potentially relevant documents because they're afraid that they're going to get in trouble if some of this stuff kind of appears. So, you know, this is why we see more and more of our clients actually using full forensics rather than trying to play the we'll just forward our messages along. There's quite a bit of case law in place right now that kind of discourages that sort of activity. We've got some examples around, so if you have a client who's kind of hemming and hawing a little bit, we can provide you with some case law that might help them make up their mind to spend the $2,000. All right. Any questions on when they'll be needed? Steve, do you think I've missed anything on this? Sam? Brittany? Okay.
I think the one thing I might add is from the client's perspective, if a salesperson marched in, so when I was at Latham Watkins, if a salesperson walked in and said, well, have you thought about this, have you thought about this, you know, you can use our forensic people to make sure the data is collected properly, and some of them are really, really pushy, and I think that's one thing we need to be careful of and be thoughtful of. Is some of these corporate clients actually have processes and systems in place to do their own self-collection. You know, they've spent a few $100,000 on, you know, a system and an infrastructure to properly do data governance and collections for e-discovery purposes. So I think the best thing to do from the sales perspective is, you know, get the client to think about, you know, what they're like. So if we're talking to a law firm, get them to ask their clients the proper questions. Do you guys have, you know, do you know whether your client has procedures and policies in place? Do they have, you know, forensic people on site internally that can do their own collections? You know, what kind of case is this? Is this the type of case where you're going to need someone, a vendor, a professional forensics examiner to go in and collect the data, or can the client do collections with some guidance from our people, or do they have, you know, people on site that can do it themselves? So I think the more important thing is to make sure that you're asking the right questions, and your law firm client is thinking and asking their clients the proper questions. So I think that's where we add a lot of value.
And this is Stephen. In some instances too, we just become kind of an extension, and we're filling in the gaps. So during that identification process, all the way on the front end before we're starting to preserve data, sometimes what we'll do is we'll get on the phone with the law firm, with the end client, and we'll start talking to the IT person about the different custodians and the different sources of data that they have. And in some instances, the client may have the ability, and they've got the infrastructure, like Sam said, and they've made the investment to do a defensible collection of email, file share. But there might be an instance where they use Gmail. You know, you've got a few custodians that use Gmail, and they use it for business purposes as well. And they may not have the infrastructure to support a Gmail collection defensively. And so that might be an instance where, you know, we're going through the process, we're understanding, you know, the different sources and custodians, and anywhere where we can fill in those gaps, you know, we can do that for them. So in those instances, we become an extension. So like Sam said, you know, we want to be able to help them scope it, ask the right questions, and fill in any gaps that might be necessary.
Excellent. So I think what I'll do is I'll modify this slide a little bit, and then after this session, I'll circulate this slide set to everybody so you guys all have it. Okay. Beautiful. Thanks, guys. That's what I was hoping we'd have here. All right, let's talk about some CSI stuff, right? Because when you talk to your friends, right, they're probably like, ooh, forensics. There is some cool stuff we can do. We can do a full forensic analysis of drives, especially if we use EnCase. We've got a bit-by-bit, bit-for-bit copy of the original drive. And we can do things like, you know, in a case of a trade secret or, you know, IP case, we can do things like look and see which USB devices have been connected to that machine. So you can find out whether there's data that might likely have been booted off of that machine just prior to collection, and that can allow us to expand the scope of collection as well. We can also do things like go through the slack spaces, they call it on the drive, and look for deleted file fragments. This can be, if you're, again, if you're trying to do that full CSI, what did they know? When did they know it? What sort of actions did they take? This can be very, very important. I've worked on a few cases where slack space and the file fragments that they found were crucial to providing settlement. Now, there's also forensic filtering, in which case we can kind of drive through the data a little bit, and we can do things like filter by file extension and hash values prior to escalation out for full processing. But we can do some cool stuff in terms of understanding the history of the drive, understanding the history of the computer, understanding the history of the documents inside of it, and then understanding even what's been deleted off of the machine as well. So we have some cool things that we can do. And again, these kinds of tools here are generally involved in trade secret or IP cases where somebody suspects the data's been altered in some fashion. Okay. All right, let's try and get this wrapped up here a little bit, and then I'm going to drop a quiz in here for about 5 minutes. So I just wanted to reiterate on the tools that we've got here. One of our basics here is EnCase. This is kind of the industry standard for collection. When you see people dragging computers out of some, white-collar crime home, that's what they're doing. They're using EnCase back at the office to make a copy of this stuff. And again, it is a bit-by-bit collection of a drive, including file fragments. Now, this is kind of the gold standard here, and this is generally what we would use if we were sending a forensics person off to somebody's location to collect their data. Now, we also have tools that allow us to collect data off of tablets and mobile devices, and that would be this tool called Celebrate, again, or Cellebrite. Again, this one is also used by law enforcement, and this can allow us to get good insight into what's going on inside of a cell phone or device, including text messages, mail, files, etc. There was some recent scares where they were running DUI checkpoints, and as part of that, they would grab somebody's phone and they would plug it into Cellebrite and find out what was going on with somebody's phone. There was some serious discussion about privacy rights on that, but just know that the cops have this stuff too. All right. So if you ever try and get out of a texting while driving ticket, good luck with that. They're going to know. All right. Now, there are also self-collection drives. We use quite a bit of this, and these are drives that we ship off to a client, and they can be operated by either by the user, a client admin, or us via WebEx. We basically WebEx into somebody's machine, and we can set these up. These are low cost. They are what are we typically charging for these, Steve? $300–400 for a drive?
Exactly. Yeah, in that range,
okay.
Depending on volume and everything, other variables.
It's a very low impact on the client. One of the things that happens when we show up to do an EnCase collection is we basically take their machine apart. With a self-collection drive, basically the drive gets plugged into the USB port on their device, and then they may or may not know, but there's very low impact on the client, and it does generate a full bit-by-bit collection, just like EnCase up here, on this drive. So it is entirely forensically valid. It does not allow the client to self-select or anything else, and this is probably our most common form of collection these days. So we have a few different ways to suit different budgets and different scenarios and different technology. All right, so finally, since we are all salespeople here, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we charge for this stuff. How do we charge for collection? Well, we have a couple ways that we can do this for full forensic collection using EnCase. It might be hourly in some cases, or we may have a fixed fee for a day of collection. So maybe we're going to show up and collect for 5 custodians, and we might say, well, we'll charge you, $2,000, and we'll just collect them all for you, which is kind of a bargain for the client. And that would be, regardless of how long it takes us, but we're basically just going to say we're going to show up for one day, we're going to collect all your data, and it's going to cost you this much. Now, that's nice because everybody likes to know what it's going to cost. Now, if we have to send those people to Topeka, Kansas or something, we may, include travel fees. We generally just pass those along without markup. But the one thing I want to make sure that we understand here is that you always want to talk to your manager prior to quoting pricing. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that the method that's proposed or that the method and the pricing model match. Okay, we want to have a conversation between the forensics team or senior management like Andy and Shamir or, Mr. Wilner about what they're trying to accomplish, and then we'll derive the methodology. So you don't want to lead with describing our methodology and then trying to figure it out on the backside. That may not go well for you. For self-collection drives, we usually just have a fixed cost for the drive in most cases, and basically what we're going to do is just mail it to them or mail it to somebody over on the client side, and then they can either deal with the collection or we're going to remote in via WebEx to facilitate the collection as well. But the one thing I always want to reiterate here is always consult with your manager prior to quoting pricing and methodology. We want to set up a consulting call with the client and our forensics team. We do want to do this every single time. Going in blind will not work well for anybody on this case. Okay. Any questions or comments on this? Steve?
I just wanted to make a couple of quick comments. So what I found to be extremely useful and helpful in terms of scoping and then also pricing forensics projects is that, so if we go all the way, to the beginning of the sales cycle and you have an introduction meeting and, you can ask questions about, what's your experience been with forensic collection and analysis? Have you done this in the past? It's a good way to to spark up that conversation and then let them know, right? These are the different sources that we can collect from, right? Have you ever seen, social media collection? Have you ever required something like that, right? So it's a very good talking piece on the front end that can get them to know that we have this service. The other thing that's very important is that 99% of the time when we collect the data, we process the data, right? So think about it that way. So once we get it in, we want to keep it as long as humanly possible, but that's going to be, extremely important part of it. And then once you actually have somebody that says, hey, I might have something, looming, at that point, we want to schedule a call with the client and one of our forensic consultants. And that's what I found to be super, super helpful for us, because what they can do is ask the right questions, understand the scope and the sources, and then from there we can put together a very specific proposal that's usually going to be right on or within a range of what that collection is going to cost. And so, so I find that to be extremely helpful. So all of this is great in terms of giving us the knowledge base so that we can answer questions, but let's make sure that anytime that there's an actual live project on the line, just get with your manager, get with somebody, and we can get with somebody in forensics, schedule a call, and make sure we scope it and price it properly.
Yeah, it's a great way to effect an almost presumptive close. Once you start that conversation with the client, chances are good you're going to wind up with the project. So, yeah, good stuff. All right.
Yeah, your law firm. Sorry, go ahead.
Please.
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, that's if like, I think our initial consultation calls, typically we offer it for free, and a good way of getting the information that you need for your proposal is to just offer up a consulting call directly with the law firm's client. A lot of times the law firm is reluctant to go and find another vendor after the initial consultation call, with their client themselves, because it looks foolish for them to go and arrange a consultation call with a specific vendor and then turn around and go use another vendor. So, like David and Stephen were saying, you're pretty much locked in. It's pretty much a done deal once you get on that collections call.
Yep.
Get the data and keep it forever, right?
Right.
Host it forever, please.
Process it, host it, whatever. Let's just get our hands on it, right? And then capitalize on that data set.
All right, let's. I want to roll out a little poll here. I've got a little 10-question survey here. It's going to take you about 5 minutes to answer here. So let me open the poll up here, and let me see if you guys can you guys all see the poll here? It's just 10 little questions here. Yep, you can see it. I see folks are working on it.
Oh, we can do.
Multiple guess.